Good afternoon. I am Jed Dobson, Professor of English and Creative Writing here at Dartmouth College. I'm also spending this year advising our provost on subjects related to AI, listening and learning, and attempting to catalyze conversations about AI on our campus and the wider world. Allow me to introduce you on behalf of the Montgomery Fellows Program. The Montgomery Fellows Program brings exceptional people to an exceptional place. That exceptional place is, of course, Dartmouth College, but it's also the Montgomery House on Occam Pond, which was purchased in 1977 through the generosity of Kenneth Morgan, class of 1925, and his wife, Harley. Our fellow today, the college's 273rd fellow, comes to share with us her research and insights about artificial intelligence. But first, a little about this lecture series. In partnership with the Montgomery Fellows Program, we've developed a series of connected visits of 4 Montgomery Fellows in the winter and spring terms. We've titled this series Agency, Speech, and Ethics in the AI Era. Our 4 fellows were selected because we consider their expertise essential to understanding the most pressing problems and opportunities connected with artificial intelligence. We've invited computer scientists, historians, legal scholars, and philosophers to help us think about the impacts of these new technologies on our campus, in our research, in our classrooms, and in everyday life. We have asked Newcomb Institute for Computational Science postdoctoral fellow Jacopo Dominicucci to introduce this afternoon's speaker. Like our speaker, Jacopo is a moral philosopher. He studies the transformations of key concepts in this contemporary digital moment: trust, misinformation, and personal relations. He has taught a course in the philosophy department titled Philosophy and Computers, and has been leading a delightful co-curricular investigation with students on the topic of happiness and AI. Will you please join me now in welcoming Jacopo?
Hi, welcome again, and thank you very much, Jed. Thank you so much for being here. Jed has already introduced the context, and perhaps we could thank again the Montgomery Fellows Program and Steve Swain and the Office of the Provost, and in particular Jed Dobson for his work on this series. Our speaker today is the current Montgomery Fellow, Sylvie Delacroix. She's the Inaugural Jeff Price Chair in Digital Law at King's College London, and she's also the Director of the Center for Data Futures at King's College London, as well as visiting professor at Tohoku University in Japan. I have been following Sylvie's work for a while, and I could tell you about her 2006 book about the sources of normativity, which connects legal normativity and moral normativity, or I could tell you about her 2022 books about habitual ethics, which is also very relevant for some of the discussions today, or I could tell you about her work, or how her work is not only influential in philosophy and in legal philosophy and in the social sciences and in computer science, but also in policy, and how it has created a social movement around a specific type of technology and a specific type of legal arrangement that she has theorized, and which empowers users in managing their data and in producing value for the community. But you will hear from her in a minute. So I'd just like to perhaps stress 3 words that I associate with her work and which I care about and which make me appreciate her work. So one is inquiry, one is creation, and one is transformation. Inquiry first. So as academics, we're all about inquiry, and we all say that we care a lot about it. And as philosophers, we've been caring a lot about it. But Sylvie's work reconnects with the Socratic interest in inquiry, which is not supposed to be just a process oriented towards a goal, which is supposed to settle the inquiry, but which is supposed to be an attitude that we carry with us in our lives, an attitude that makes our individual lives and our collective lives better, because it allows us to cultivate a certain openness and it allows us to be open to certain forms of well-reasoned change. I think that this element of inquiry will also be interesting in connection with her work on LLMs. Another key terms that I associate with her work, and which I appreciate in her work, is creation. So Sylvie's work, both on the more legal and on the more moral side and on the more technological side, tends to empower humans to create something that corresponds to their values, to create in a reflective way. So in general, she doesn't think of values as something that you can just pick around the world. You don't just go out and find them and sort out your values by reference to something that is already set out there. But it's not something either that you can just make up at your own will. It's rather something that we create in specific ways. It's something for which specific practices and institutions have a role in creating the conditions of creation and also of the slowing down of this creation sometimes. And again, LLMs will connect to this question of how we create our values together, perhaps. And finally, transformation. So across the different strands of our work, transformation comes again and again as something that is at the same time a hope and a fear of something that is both a hope and a fear individually and collectively. It's about finding space for productive and interesting sources of transformation, and at the same time creating structures that channel these transformations in directions that we might want together. But transformation is not just something that Sylvie speaks about, it's also something that she does. So the social movement that she started around data trusts, as well as now her work with the Center for Data Futures, and the way she engages with policy and with practitioners, with human-computer interaction, with computer scientists, with policymakers on different levels, and with different strands of civil society, is something that creates immediate and tangible change and which empowers not just users, but communities to make technology more human and to make technology something that takes part in the co-creation of our values and in the continuation of our collective inquiry. So today's talk is on the architecture of moral attention, LLMs, habit plasticity, and moral transformations. Please join me in welcoming Sylvie Delacroix to Dartmouth.
So thank you, Jacopo, for this generous introduction. I would also like to thank the Montgomery Fellowship Program for this amazing opportunity, and also Jed Dobson here for his vision behind this AI program here at Dartmouth. I think it's a very exciting and worthwhile endeavor, and I'm very keen to support it in any way I can. Now, I'm going to start with a little bit of genealogy. I do like genealogies. And I'll tell you this. I've always been fascinated by our power or capacity for change. This is something that's always been a bugbear, you could call it. And it became particularly salient as a concern as well for me as an academic when I was teaching future lawyers, like fresh, first year future lawyers. We typically, in the UK, we always teach about something called legal positivism. Now, you don't need to know anything about legal positivism except this. For legal positivists, it's very important to distinguish between what the law is on one hand and what the law ought to be on the other hand. Why is it so important? Because without that distinction, the saying goes, we would not be able to critically assess the law and call it into question and perhaps call it to account when it fails, when it doesn't live up to our aspirations. Yeah? So legal positivism is often justified as a movement of thought because of the importance of empowering us citizens to critically consider the law, legal institutions. They're not God-given things, we make them. And as such, we should hold them to account, right? So that's the idea. Now, so far, so good. But I've always been troubled by the fact that this seems a bit optimistic. Think about it. Say had I been born in, I don't know, apartheid South Africa, would I necessarily have had the kind of critical presence of mind to see the institutions that structure apartheid South Africa as deficient, as wanting, morally speaking? Yeah? It's not that easy to assume that we necessarily, as citizens, that are we are necessarily embedded in a social context that make us value certain things. Yeah? We don't construct ourselves from scratch. We are influenced by all sorts of things, people around us, institutions around us, etc. So can we really postulate this ability to critically consider existing institutions and change them? That's something that's bothered me. And that's what actually led me to write this book, Habitual Ethics, because for years I was making no progress because I thought I was writing a book on moral change and try and define moral change. That's tricky. What counts as moral change? And I started making progress when I started thinking, but maybe if I think about habits as what can sometimes stand in the way of change, then I might get to something more concrete. And that's how I started writing this book. Now, that's the anecdote. Now, today, I want to connect this fundamental capacity to bring about change with something that might seem completely unrelated. And that's our conversations with artificial intelligence, large language models in particular. This connection matters a great deal to me because I think we are today at a very particular moment in time where there is an opportunity to change the direction of travel. Okay? And I feel a particular responsibility in that respect. And I hope I can convince you to share that responsibility in whatever way you can. So, for the first time, we have systems who can truly converse with us. We've never had that before. That's significant. So we don't just query them. We don't just command them. We can engage in back and forth dialogue. And this conversational quality of large language models brings about unprecedented possibilities for how technology might support, rather than diminish, our moral growth. So that's going to be a theme of this lecture. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to try and make 3 points. The first one is that our capacity for moral transformation depends on our habits remaining flexible enough or plastic enough. Okay, so that's going to be the first point, especially the habits of attention, so what we notice or what we overlook habitually. The second point I'm going to make is that certain kinds of conversation, I'm going to call them sense-making conversations, serve as vital testing and honing grounds for those habits of attention. When we talk, for instance, about feelings of unease because, say, we've witnessed a situation that we feel is not quite right, or when we talk about intuitions that we can't quite fully articulate, we are actually in the process of honing these habits of attention. The third point I'm going to make is that as AI systems, large language models in particular, increasingly join these conversations, they can be used as sense-making conversational partners. They could either eliminate the uncertainty that moral growth requires, or they could create new kinds of spaces for exploring those tentative thoughts that we need to explore in order to grow. Okay. So this either or, there's like a junction here, is why today's moment matters so much, in my opinion. The design choices we make today will shape whether these systems support or suppress our collective moral imagination. By giving users ways to continually or continuously refine how, for instance, these systems communicate uncertainty, that's something I'm going to talk about, we could create what I call transitional conversational spaces. And these conversational spaces are important to strengthen our democratic capabilities. So that's going to be the gist of my lecture today. I'm going to start now with the first point, the point about moral transformation. Now, the concepts and ideas that we associate with democratic practices basically stop making sense without assuming that we have this capacity for transformation. Why? Well, think about what responsibility really means. It doesn't really make sense unless we can break from the social conditioning that has made us value what we do value currently, right? So why would you hold someone accountable if that person basically couldn't possibly have done otherwise? So we need to assume that there is a possibility of transformation, that there is a possibility for me to abstract myself from the social environment that has made me think the way I do or value the way I do, right? Now, so moral responsibility needs the possibility of change, and it needs our ability to step up and step back and consider how things could be done differently. Without this capacity for transformation, basically, responsibility becomes hollow. But here's the thing. This capacity for change is not guaranteed. It can be compromised. It's fragile. And the two sides of transformation, changing ourselves on one hand and changing the environment around us, are often deeply connected. When someone fights for social justice, for instance, they're likely to be transformed in the process. Or when an artist produces something genuinely new, as an artist, they will experience some kind of transformation. So as our environment becomes increasingly algorithm-driven, what happens to the conditions that make this process of transformation possible? Well, many things can block our ability for self-transformation. There are, of course, psychological factors, like, for instance, a fear of change or some sense of comfort with what is already known or the familiar. So that's one thing. There's also sometimes social factors like inherent conservatism or institutional resistance, to use the French word. But I want to focus on something more basic. Our habitual ways of seeing things. When I look at the environment, I will have elements of that environment that will be habitually salient, that will attract my attention at the cost of other aspects of my environment. That's inevitable. We humans only have a limited capacity to process data, unlike computers. And so we have to selectively pay attention, right? But of course, we need to be able to break the mold. We need to be able to challenge this salience. Yeah? We need to be able to consider what is not usually seen. So before we can change anything, we first have to notice what needs to be changed. And that can be a challenge. So this ability to change is certainly not fixed. It develops through experience, and it can be sharpened or dulled. So in other words, our habits of attention, what we automatically notice or overlook, play a crucial role in this process of development that makes us capable of change, right? Now, throughout history, philosophers have often viewed habit with suspicion, at least a strand of philosophy. They've warned that habits can make us blind to the world and to ourselves. When actions become automatic, we stop noticing things that might otherwise call for our attention. The familiar becomes invisible. Because of this, a large strand of moral philosophy worries that habit is basically the enemy of genuine freedom, what we need to overcome in order to be truly ethical. But this tells only half of the story. And it's only really one strand of moral philosophy. Habits are not born rigid. When something momentarily escapes your conscious awareness, let's say I've been trying to get the habit of going jogging, and for months I had to painfully put my running shoes on, etc., until one day I find myself on the pavement in my running gear, and I realize I have a Zoom call in 2 minutes. But I could rejoice because this is proof that I have formed the habit of going running. It has momentarily escaped my conscious awareness. Now, does it mean that I am the slave of that habit? No. I can change it. In fact, without habits, I would be paralyzed. Yeah? Habits not only anchor our sense of self, they also enable countless skills. Like, for instance, I would not be able to give this talk today without having habits. If I had to think consciously about every word I'm uttering, I would be in deep trouble. So, habits basically automate components of our lives so that our attention can be freed or redirected and operate at different levels. Okay. So, the problem when it comes to our ability to enact change is not habit itself. It's probably better put as habit rigidification. Now, my book, Habitual Ethics, which Jacopo mentioned, explores what keeps habits flexible enough to be at the service of our ethical lives. Right? What are the factors that keep these habits plastic enough? Now, flexible habits do maintain a certain relationship to attention. That is something I develop a lot in the book. They also remain available to awareness when needed. They adapt to evolving goals. Rigid habits, by contrast, resist modification even when circumstances demand change. And this rigidity, of course, undermines our ability to transform both ourselves and the environment around us. Now, while personal attitudes do influence habit flexibility, our environment plays a crucial role, what I call collective infrastructures, and especially the parts of our environment that we collectively create. Now, these include the spaces that shape how we move, laws that structure social interaction, and increasingly, technologies that mediate daily activities. And among these technologies, large language models are truly something new. Now, this is time where I want to hear from you. Can you pick one feature of LLMs, except people who've heard this question before, they are excluded from this question. But I would like you to tell me, or to pick one feature that makes LLMs different from previous data-reliant technology we've had before. Right? What is it that makes LLMs different? I assume you've heard about LLMs. Yeah? LLMs, large language models. Think ChatGPT. Right? What makes them different from previous data-reliant technology? Yes?
Massive amounts of data and the way that individual datum points are linked together through statistical models.
Okay, great. So large amounts of data and the way in which these data points are linked through statistical models. That's my quick summary of what was said here. Any other possible answer? Yeah?
Confident hallucinations?
Confident hallucinations, yeah, sure, that is a feature. But what makes them so different from what's gone on before? Yeah?
They talk to us.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. So they talk to us. This seems a very mundane fact, right? But we can enter into conversations with these tools. That is nothing short of revolutionary. It's super significant. And I'm going to try to explain why. So, unlike previous technologies, large language models directly participate in our conversations. And this is a big deal because conversations are one of the primary mechanisms through which we develop moral understanding. That's what I'm going to try and put forward. Okay. Now, to grasp this, I think it helps to go a step back and reflect about the role of conversations in our lives. Why do we converse? Anybody? Why do we converse? Why do we enter into conversations with people? Yeah?
To get information, share information, and negotiate relationships.
Okay, to get information, share information, and negotiate relationships. Okay. I'm not satisfied with that answer. There is room for more. Anything else? Yeah?
It's interesting to talk to other people.
It's interesting to talk to other people, sure. Yeah?
To feel connected.
Thank you, to feel connected. Yes, so we don't always converse to share information. But it's quite remarkable that when you look at the current computer science literature, and especially human-computer interaction studies, we're still very much under the kind of paradigm of information-conveying tools. But large language models are way more than information-conveying tools. And this matters, right? So at some point, for instance, I remember there was a time when there was all the hype about ChatGPT, and then Alison Gopnik tried to counter this hype by saying, well, they're just another type of cultural technologies. Well, I think she went too far in that counter-argument. Why did she go too far? Because actually, so by cultural technologies, she was putting large language models in the same bucket as libraries, search engines, books, you name it, right? Basically, information-conveying technology. But large language models are fundamentally different because we can converse with them. And it amazes me how it's actually taking quite a lot of time for people to get their head around this and the significance of this. So when we converse, sometimes we converse because we share a bench, a physical space. Sometimes we converse to cheer each other up. Sometimes we converse to make plans or forms in Davos. But sometimes, crucially, this is really important, we converse in order to try and make sense of the world around us. Now, think about this. Sometimes there may be a moment in time where I've witnessed, clearly, let's say I've witnessed a troubling incident, right? I've witnessed a scene that makes me feel that something has happened that is not quite right. But I struggle to articulate why this is not quite right. I struggle to articulate the roots of those intuitions. What do? Well, if I'm a lucky human being, I might find an interlocutor who is humble enough and prepared to talk to me in a way that opens up the space for exploration, that allows me to explore those tentative views. But that doesn't happen every day. Why does it not happen every day? Because actually, to find an interlocutor who's prepared to express herself in a way that does not kind of close down the space for exploration, you need someone who's prepared to express uncertainty, to express what I call humility markers. What are humility markers? Is when, let's say we talk about end-of-life care conversations, and I say, well, I'm not so sure that I would like to be treated in such and such circumstance. Why am I saying I'm not so sure? I'm not saying this to invite you to go in and check the facts. That's not the point. The point is to flag my commitment to a type of conversation that allows for a variety of views, that basically commits myself and my interlocutor to a type of conversation that can be exploratory. Right? These are precious moments, and these are fragile moments. Now, we've already talked about the fact that conversations go well beyond information transfer. And I was basically talking about the fact that these conversations are also fragile, right? And they need humility markers. Now, what is interesting here is the extent to which we need, for these conversations to do their work, we need something that I call productive uncertainty. And this productive uncertainty requires what I call these humility markers, right? Where you signal, as an interlocutor, you signal your openness to exploration. Now, without these humility markers, sense-making conversations basically collapse into information-conveying moments, right? So these sense-making conversations matter for transformation because they're where we continuously sharpen our ability to notice when change is needed in ourselves and in our practices. So I hope I've made clear the link between the possibility of transformation on one hand and certain types of conversation, sense-making conversations. Okay. So basically, if you follow my line of argument, you end up with this conclusion that sense-making conversations are a type of infrastructure, a crucial type of infrastructure for ethical development. Right. Now, through them, through these sense-making conversations, community develops shared ways of noticing and articulating significant features of situations. Now, this happens not through abstract theorizing, but through talking about concrete experiences. When someone articulates a feeling that, for instance, they feel a bit iffy about the situation they've just witnessed, and when they find a receptive partner, which is not necessarily always the case, that perception gradually becomes available to others. So over time, these shared perceptions transform moral understanding at a community level. Think about concepts like sexual harassment, environmental harm, or various forms of discrimination. They first emerged through people trying to articulate their experiences when these experiences lacked established frameworks. Yeah? Before we had the concept of sexual harassment, it was difficult to actually articulate why you felt that the situation you'd been in was wrong. Okay. So these articulations first had to find receptive audiences, in particular conversational context, before achieving broader significance or broader recognition. Now, today, this is the important fact. Today, LLMs are entering these conversational spaces, right? Unlike books or social media, they actively shape conversational flows in real time. Now, this ability to simulate dialogue fundamentally changes the environments in which moral understanding develop. So this goes well beyond the classic issues of transparency or bias that you may have heard in AI ethics. Yeah, we talk a lot about transparency and bias, etc. The distinctive characteristics of LLMs, their conversational nature, their scale, and their systematic handling of uncertainty demand attention because they are reshaping the very infrastructure of moral development, the very infrastructure that allows us to evolve as a society, right? Now, to understand what's at stake and also the possibilities for intervention, I think it's helpful to talk about uncertainty, especially what I call productive uncertainty. Unlike human partners, who naturally introduce variations in the way they speak, large language models they cannot but reproduce patterns in their training data. Of course, they can do that with a degree of serendipity, but they still reproduce patterns. Okay. Now, this statistical approach typically favors clear answers over tentative possibilities. When uncertainty is treated as a problem to be solved rather than a space to maintain, the conditions necessary for developing new moral perceptions and potentially recognize the need for change, these conditions can become compromised. Oh, sorry, that's my slide, yeah. So our capacity to notice morally significant features depends on what cognitive scientists sometimes call the kind of landscape of affordances, right? The range of possibilities our environment makes available. So for instance, if there's a chair there that it gives me an affordance in the sense that I can sit on it. Yeah? So it gives me the possibility of sitting on it. That's an affordance. Now, our attention habits develop through dynamic interaction with these environments. And LLMs basically represent a particularly powerful form of environmental influence, given their ability to systematically structure our conversational spaces. So if you keep in mind the role of conversations in shaping our collective ability to see and notice, then this is a big deal, the fact that LLMs intervene in that space. When conversational environments basically optimize for efficiency rather than exploration, or basically the perceptual skills necessary to develop new moral understandings are compromised. Now, without these skills, our capacity to recognize when change is needed in ourselves and our institutions weaken. Now, moral understanding develops across a spectrum, from tentative explorations, where we're not quite sure whether there's something wrong or not. We might not even be sure how to articulate it, all the way to very formalized expressions which are fully articulated and fully rationalized and are basically ready for the public sphere. Now, the early stages is where intuitions first receive tentative expressions, often through one-to-one conversations. And this movement from initial articulation towards broader recognition at the public level depends on basically supportive spaces where emerging moral perceptions can be explored. Now, typically, professional communities, civil society organizations, or cultural spaces often play a critical role in supporting these tentative perceptions. Yeah. And my worry is that unless we intervene with the concrete design choices I'm about to outline, I worry that LLMs risk flattening basically this ecology, this ecosystem of institutions that normally play a role in allowing this passage from tentative views to more public, fully articulated opinions. So, LLMs have the potential to subtly transform how we collectively notice ethical issues. This happens at least in 3 key ways. First, these AI systems organize information based on statistical patterns that they found in human writing, not from actual lived moral experiences. And this matters. I'll explain why. Second, we get the illusion of diverse viewpoints without genuine encounter. So AI creates simulated versions of different perspectives, but these perspectives lack the genuine challenge of meeting someone who is truly different from us. Yes, sometimes that encounter with a real person matters in terms of appreciating the significance of, let's say, a moral difference. And third, AI can present many viewpoints, but strips away the lived stakes that give human perspectives their weight or their moral force. So when viewpoints become detached from the real experiences that form them, they can lose the urgency that makes us care about ethical issues in the first place. So in simpler terms, LLMs may give us patterns without experience, perspectives without genuine challenges, and viewpoints without emotional stakes. All of this has the potential to change how we engage with ethical questions as communities. And this is where I go into the more concrete part of this lecture. Some of you may be relieved to hear. These challenges also present opportunities. Rather than focusing solely on aligning algorithm with existing moral values, we could design systems that support our ongoing development of moral perception itself. Right? So this means creating what I call attention-conscious architectures. Systems designed not merely to encode fixed moral values, but to support our collective capacity to notice and articulate emerging moral challenges. So this approach requires moving beyond technical fixes to address fundamental questions about the relationship between technology and democracy. How might technological systems support, rather than hinder, our collective moral imagination? Now here, that's where the participatory potential of LLMs becomes crucial. Now, I'm sure you, I hope most of you have interacted with a large language model. And at the moment, this potential for interaction is very primitive. There's basically thumbs up or thumbs down, very individualistic and very binary kind of feedback that you can give. Of course, we can also feedback through the words we give to the system, but it's still not, for instance, enabling groups of people to collectively feed feedback to these systems, right? So this matters in domains like education, healthcare, and justice, where individual users are not, where you really want to empower groups of users to collectively deliberate about their experiences in using these tools and potentially validating that feedback to contribute to an ongoing learning loop. So rather than attempting to replace human moral conversation, these systems, large language models, could serve as what I call transitional conversational spaces, environments where nascent moral perceptions can be explored before entering the fully public sphere that typically demands fully rationalized, well-articulated reasons. So by giving users continuous input into how systems handle uncertainty, this is a particular application that I'm particularly interested in, we could create interfaces that acknowledge their limitations while supporting basically inquisitive forms of interaction that enhance moral perception. Okay. Now, in my view, the debate is clearly not about whether to embrace or reject these technologies, right? I hope you got that point by now. It's about how to design and deploy these systems in a way that enhances our collective capacity for moral perception. The window of opportunity won't remain open forever, I think. Today, we have a chance to influence the way these systems are designed. And I hope I am not naive in thinking that there is still time to design these genuinely participatory interfaces that could mean that groups of users, whether they're primary care doctors, whether they are, judges and the clerks that work with them, or whether they are educators, these are the three fields where I work a lot. Could we empower these groups of users to collectively and iteratively refine how these systems interact with them over time? And in particular, uncertainty is very interesting because if you think about how humans express uncertainty when we talk human to human, I'm constantly adapting the way I express uncertainty, right? I will adapt to your body signals. I will adapt to the types of answers you give me. Why can't we try and replicate this kind of ongoing adaptation when it comes to our interactions with large language models? I think it's actually vital. And it could turn large language models into an opportunity to revive our democratic practices. Okay, so effectively, the interfaces I have in mind would recognize uncertainty not as a problem to be solved, but as a productive space that is essential to democratic moral development. Now, I wonder if I have time for examples. I think I do. Okay. So I'll give you a few examples of things I'm working on for the moment, because this is not just abstract philosophy. I try to basically, this is something, by the way, that I care a lot about as a point of methodology, right? I am a philosopher, I'm a lawyer, but I strongly believe that we've talked too much, that basically there is a propensity among philosophers, lawyers, sociologists, you name them, to go into grand abstract discourses about these tools, like the large language models that we're developing today, but in a way that does not take any risk, because it's only by truly trying to experiment with the design of these tools that you can, A, bring about change, and B, learn what is possible, what is not possible, etc. So in other words, I urge my colleagues, I urge my students to get their hands dirty, to get wet. And that means collaborating with designers like Tam here. I went to his class yesterday. It was fantastic. I heard his students designing these very cool wearables that can track your, I don't know if I got this right, but these brain waves that tell you when you've reached a deep meditation state. I mean, how cool is that? And I was talking to students saying, but have you considered the fact that users in the future may have a different agenda? They may think that they want to reach a different state of meditation, like, so that you, the designers, should perhaps make these tools tinkerable, so that users in the future can genuinely not just interact with these tools, but change them, tinker with them to suit their purposes. In principle, there's nothing fundamentally, let's say, difficult about this. It's just that we're not in the habit of designing tools that are tinkerable, right? Partly because of commercial incentives that quite clearly doesn't really align with the interest of large corporations at the moment, okay? So as examples, one of the things I do is I work with primary care doctors who, for instance, care a lot about the fact that they all use large language models already. In the UK, a primary care doctor has 10 minutes to listen to a patient, make an informed decision about what among the narrative presented by the patient, what are the key elements that require investigation, and if they require investigation, what are the tests that should be ordered, etc. Right? That's one scenario. Imagine, in 10 minutes, and you have to take into account all sorts of other factors, social factors, family factors. Is this person, let's say that that person presents with very confusing, changing symptoms, and the doctor notices a bruise on her arm. The LLM communicates to the doctor that, you know, there's like a 60% chance that this person might be suffering from, I don't know, I'm not a doctor myself, but it could list a list of possible diagnoses and likely tests to consider, right? That's very much within the realm of possibilities. You could even make it color-coded with different confidence scores. That's what LLMs don't really do yet, right? But how does the LLM, could it communicate to the doctor the fact that perhaps questions need to be asked about situation at home? So if the doctor, for instance, raises the bruise on the arm, how should that be communicated as a point of investigation? That is a sensitive matter. And that is not something that you can quantify as a oh, I am 60% certain that this person suffers from domestic abuse. I don't think you can do that, right? So this is a type of non-quantifiable uncertainty. But that is no less important than the quantifiable types of uncertainty that doctors deal with, okay? And so these are very real challenges. It's how do you design LLMs that can communicate both quantifiable and non-quantifiable types of uncertainty. These are crucial questions in domain like healthcare, in domain like education. I'll give you another example. So imagine an LLM that is designed to be basically a remote homework provider. Yeah. And let's say that I'm Emily, and I've submitted a book summary. So I submit my homework online, and I get feedback from the LLM. Actually, LLMs are actually already very, very good at producing detailed feedback, much more detailed than a teacher would have time to do. And we can already, I have a colleague working on basically calculating the probability that the score provided by the LLM is like the score that would be provided by, say, a group of 10 teachers. So you can quantify the likelihood of this kind of score as a numerical factor. You can quantify the extent to which it is likely to be like that of 10 human teachers, right? That is all doable. But there are questions that these computer scientists have not considered. For instance, let's say that my book summary was about a story that involves arranged marriage, right? And let's say that my book summary takes arranged marriage at face value, like as if that's just a standard practice, right? Now, that is a very value-loaded question. Should the LLM pick up the fact that this is a contested practice, a contested concept, and perhaps signal either to the teacher or to the student directly, if there is no teacher involved, that this could be considered from different viewpoints, and that really this is a contested concept? Have you considered looking at this book and this book to widen your horizon, etc.? That's a very morally loaded choice. And it depends on your pedagogical stance to some extent, right? But so here, again, this is a type of uncertainty that is not quantifiable. First, it will depend on the objectives you have in designing that large language model as a homework provider. But there will be another example, actually, that I gave last week in a workshop is imagine an LLM that is designed to train students in math. That's a much more, in a way, interesting example, because an LLM could be very good at quantifying the extent to which it is confident that the student has mastered the procedural steps for a particular mathematical operation. But how do you capture the extent to which that student has actually mastered the conceptual understanding behind the mathematical operation? So that is much more difficult to capture in a quantified way. So I would argue that that is also a non-quantifiable type of uncertainty. So how do you design a large language model that can not only communicate the extent to which the student has mastered, say, procedural steps for a particular mathematical problem, but also master the conceptual understanding behind it? Tricky. Okay, so these are two examples. I'm going to move on to finish this lecture to emphasize this. I think today we are at a pivotal moment. I am genuinely both excited, and I also feel the burden of a big responsibility that certainly is not only mine, and I hope I can convince you to share that responsibility, but because for the first time, we have technologies that actively participate in our conversations. And these conversations are the primary medium through which we make more sense of our world. The way we design these systems will shape whether they support or hinder our capacity for moral transformation. And right now, we have a unique opportunity to get it right. By focusing on participatory interfaces, I've talked a little bit about it, I'm happy to talk more about it. So interfaces that give groups of users meaningful input into, for instance, how uncertainty is communicated. We could create, or we could at least pave the way towards genuinely democratic AI, or AI that can support our democracies rather than undermine them. Systems that serve as bridges between private intuition and fully articulated positions. Technologies that strengthen rather than weaken our collective moral imagination. This is clearly not just about avoiding harm. It's about recognizing a profound possibility that well-designed conversational AI might actually enhance our most distinctly human capacity. And what is that capacity? If you followed me, you will say our capacity to change things, both ourselves and the world around us. So, the architecture of moral attention, how we collectively notice things and perhaps overlook them, depends on spaces where productive uncertainty can flourish. Our technological choices now will determine whether these spaces expand or contract in the coming years. By designing for participation rather than optimization, for exploration rather than resolution, we might create systems that strengthen the conversational infrastructure upon which democracy depends. This is the opportunity before us, not just to make AI ethical in some static sense, which makes no sense, actually, but to design technologies that support our ongoing capacity for moral transformation. Here's the word transformation again. In other words, the very foundations of democratic life. I don't think we can have democratic life without the possibility of transformation. And that's it. Now, if what I've said makes you wish for more, or this is a paper I've recently posted online. Yeah, it's still a draft, so I'd value your feedback. I'll leave the QR code if you're interested. Now, as for a concrete endeavor to develop participatory interfaces, that's what the Center for Data Futures, which I've recently created in King's College London, is all about. Yeah, it's a center, it's probably the only center in the world that focuses on participatory infrastructure over the life cycle of data-reliant tools. So from the point of data generation, through data empowerment structures, data trusts, data co-ops, et cetera, all the way to the point of deployment, where the aim is to develop interfaces that not only allow, but incentivize critical engagement on the part of users. That's it. I think it's time for questions.
Thank you. I was curious if you have seen the reporting over the weekend of researchers from the University of Zurich who conducted an experiment on the Change My Views subreddit by deploying bots to publish nearly 1,800 comments, each going through the post history of the comments they were replying to in an attempt to specifically tailor their responses to affect change in the position of the person they were responding to.
All right.
This was done without anybody really knowing that these were bots, so people posting in these communities would have assumed that they were responding to and conversing with real humans, when in fact they were responding to the responses of an LLM.
Yeah.
I'm curious what sort of insights you might have in terms of rebuilding a community after something like that. Where does the trust sort of evaporate when you are not sure whether you are speaking with a human or not?
Yeah. No, this encapsulates quite a lot of different questions. First, what is it called, the bot? Like, is there a name for it? I forgot.
I'm not sure if there was a specific bot mentioned. The university seems to have retracted as much of the research as they have been able to and have deleted as many of the original comments as possible. Thank you. So I'm not aware of a mention of a particular model.
Okay.
I guess, some sort of ethics oversight board at the University of Zurich had made recommendations as to how this experiment were to be conducted. Those recommendations were not binding legally or otherwise, so the experiment proceeded.
Okay, right. So first, there are things that I have not talked about. I cannot talk about everything, right? There will be very clearly all sorts of challenges to do with misinformation, misleading. These large language models have infinite potential for manipulation and misinformation. Yeah, that is a fact. I chose not to focus this lecture on this because I think this has already captured the attention of a lot of people. What has not captured the attention of as many people as I would like is the opportunities that are still open today when it comes to building participatory interfaces. I do not think we can, so on one hand, what I see are these safety issues. These are safety issues, right, about misinformation, manipulation, et cetera. They will need very robust infrastructure that is primarily, I think, publicly funded. And what I'm talking about is not meant to preempt that in any way, right? So for me, the need for participatory infrastructure is more an argument about saying, look, of course we need regulation. Of course we're going to need safety mechanism, very robust ones at that. But let's not fool ourselves to think that it can all be top-down. I see a real danger of engaging with these new types of technologies in a way that's effectively only encouraging even more passivity on our part, where we think, it's the role of the state to protect us, to regulate, et cetera. And I think that's very problematic from a perspective of civic responsibility, but it's also corrosive over the longer term. So that's why I'm very keen on putting efforts and thoughts into these more bottom-up mechanism, in this case, participatory interfaces, that I think can complement the more top-down, safety-conscious interventions that are needed. Right? So I don't know if that answers your question, because I think your question is primarily a question about actually safety. But yeah.
Thank you.
So this, I really like your presentation and your framing here. I have a question about the idea that the novel element of the LLMs is their ability to engage in conversation. I think that's true in terms of sort of the apparent activity that they present. But if I go back to if we think about books, I think many people have had relationships with fundamental books in their lives that feel like conversations, where they find themselves continually reinterrogating the text that they read and thought they understood at one point in their life with different experiences and have a different engagement, go back and read it and find some new elements.
Yeah.
So I guess I wonder if, I'm not trying to argue with you about whether or not that's a correct characterization, but I guess I wonder if there are ways that we can learn from perhaps other more primitive, what we might now call more primitive forms of conversation that people engaged with earlier cultural technologies, and learn from them about how to structure, because a book is very gentle, right? You read it, it doesn't attack you, it doesn't troll you, right? It just waits there for you to come and find it again.
Yeah.
There's a gentleness about the way that conversation unfolds.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Of course, it's also a little more limited. It's one-sided. The author doesn't get to go rewrite the text based on what you've thought.
Yeah, yeah.
But I do wonder if there are elements we could pull out of those kind of earlier conversations that we might be able to deploy in creating the kinds of LLMs that you're asking for.
I think that's very interesting, and it's possible. Here I'm imagining, right? I have no certainty for sure, but it's possible that we find ourselves at the very beginnings of a story which leads to very different subtypes of LLMs. So basically, so you could imagine a scenario where, so first I'll start with the scenario I have in mind. That's a very concrete, real scenario where you have a primary care doctor who had a difficult conversation with a patient that day. On her way back to work, she decides to talk to an LLM to go back through that conversation she had with the patient and say, I wonder if I handled that conversation very well. The patient was very angry. What could I have done differently? This is a real example of actually a GP using an LLM to, in part, tease out intuitions or sense of unease, and in part, as a kind of, she doesn't want to burden her husband when she comes home with that conversation, perhaps, and so she talks to an LLM. Now, some people, when I gave that example, were up in arms saying, well, she shouldn't talk to an LLM about that. This is a sense-making conversation that should be directed at humans, not LLMs, right? There was a very strong reaction from some people. And equally, luckily in the room, I had primary care doctors who said, well, who are you to deprive us from a very useful tool? We don't, most primary care doctors are overwhelmed. In the UK, 10 minutes is a very short time to do a consultation. They don't have time to often get answers to their questions that they have when they encounter patients. And so these LLMs can be a fantastic tool to unpack concerns, et cetera, right, in a dialogic manner. That's one example where, for this purpose, these doctors might say, well, we want more than a book, really. We really want something that can talk back at us, but in a way that's, yeah, it's seen as an exercise in unpacking intuitions, right? But then at the other end, you could say, like I'm thinking of our encounters with a piece of art, for instance, right? Just it's similar to the way you might read a novel. And so there is nothing that would stop us from, for instance, designing types of LLMs that are meant to function much more like that, as perhaps presenting us interesting outputs from time to time that might or might not capture our attention, that might or might not provoke us to think differently. So that you could, in fact, we also have generative AI that can produce images, right? So you can, interestingly, design LLMs just for the purpose of being possible windows into other worlds or different ways of thinking, but without necessarily the kind of active talking back, right? So I can imagine that at the moment we talk about LLMs as a generic thing, but I imagine very different versions of these tools that could capture your point, I think, possibly.
Hi, my name is Lily. We're here. I'm a librarian, and I really work with students from the STEM disciplines. And I'm just kind of curious to hear about your conversations with youngsters thrown into using LLMs. Because young college students, high schoolers, things like that. Because from my perspective, folks generally talk about LLMs as like the magic bullet that increases efficiency. So slowing down and using an LLM as a more a conversational partner that provides you all of the perspectives in the room and things like that isn't where I'm seeing a large population of the students that I interact with looking at it. So I'm just kind of curious to hear what that looks like for you.
That's a great question, but that's on us educators, right? Yeah. I think as educators, we haven't really started reflecting creatively enough about how to use these large language models. Now, one thing, for instance, I'll give you an example that I'm considering for, I often teach ethics to students. And, there's an argument for saying, well, what's the point of assigning essays to students these days? They'll just use a large language model, waste of time. And so there was this idea of saying, well, the Socratic method. We don't have the resources to have one-to-one conversations with students that might be based on a very provocative ethical dilemma, potentially. But with LLMs, we could design them as a kind of, where, let's say, the student has to take one side of a dilemma where the LLM takes the other side. Now, you could imagine a scenario where you ask the students, okay, you don't only just enter into dialogue with these systems, but afterwards, the students are asked to evaluate the perceived quality of the conversation with the LLM and for instance, examine the role that the communication of uncertainty played in the perceived quality of that communication. Now that becomes quite interesting because, and you could even ask this, you could split the class in two, have human to humans on one hand, human to LLM on the other hand, compare the experiences, get the students to evaluate the perceived quality of conversations in either case. I think a lot could be learned in this context. Certainly for philosophy and ethics, I can see potential, right? So to answer your question, I think we are at the beginnings of thinking through the use of these tools. Yeah.
Hi, this was a fantastic talk. Thank you. This is a bit of an underformed question, so I apologize for that. But when you were talking about like open source, tinkerable tools and models, one of the things that came to mind was that like for Claude, for example, I get much better results if I do a form of structured prompt engineering where I mark specifically where I want it to think, I give specific examples. But that puts a lot of onus on me as the user to figure out what kind of interaction I want to have. And in an information-seeking sense, meaning context, I think that works pretty well for me. But if I'm thinking through a moral issue, that feels like a different experience and a different onus to put on a user to invite that kind of pushback.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I don't think we should treat LLMs as the universal what's it called, like Swiss knife, which does everything in one instantiation. So if I could encourage students, for instance, you could design an app like a Socratic app, right? That could be designed for the purpose of sense-making conversations. And then it's designed differently, where you could still allow the user to set parameters or change the way the communication goes to some extent. But this invites different choices from someone who uses LLMs to explore, I don't know, the intricacies of coding, right? So I think this is one thing. But the true tinkerability is a really difficult thing to get our heads around, right? Because it's not just a matter of being able to set parameters. It's really a matter of also saying to users, you might think of uses, of purposes that are completely different from what the designers had in mind. And can we design these tools in such a way that at the moment, these models are actually accessible online, open source in some cases. Often we don't have the training data that goes with it. But increasingly, we have evidence that that doesn't matter too much, that you can do this process of refinement without having at your disposal tons and tons of data. Now, that is interesting from the perspective of tinkerability. Because so one of the things I'm really interested in is precisely this potential for communities, groups, you can define them at different levels, to progressively form these tools to fit their goals, to fit their purposes. It's interesting. There are, of course, hazards with this, right? Because if you think about this as a process of personalization, then we risk falling into exactly the same kind of echo chambers that we've already encountered with social media. So how do we prevent that? These are interesting questions.
I think a lot of the conversation today has been focused on using AI as like a way to explore uncertainty. But similar to what Lily was saying about how students and young people nowadays are using it as more of an efficiency tool, do you think like LLMs should continue to have a role in like just information gathering? Like students ask a question that has like a concrete answer, or they're trying to find some information. And do you think that role should be somewhat distinct from the LLMs that are used in conversation? Because I think of one analogy with human interactions, where sometimes people will be in a situation where they're interacting with a real person, like maybe a cashier or something, where they're focused on efficiency. They're not focused on conversation. They're not seeking to have that kind of personal connection.
Yeah.
But it is a real person. So there's a danger that I am a little bit concerned about in like if people get used to conflating conversation, like LLMs, with purely, efficiency information gathering LLMs. Could they do that with human relationships too?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you. I think that's a fascinating question. How do we address it? I don't have an immediate answer to you, except for perhaps precisely, to me, this is another argument for calling for sub-tools, like for basically re-emphasizing the value inherent in being able to enter into a conversation. So for instance, designing a Socratic app may help bring to light the very different, I call them affordances, but some people don't like the word affordances, so the very different possibilities, let's put it this way, that can be had from these tools, right? So that you could have already we have search engines that use generative AI to produce quick summaries. And so these are very different kinds of tools for very different kinds of needs from the kind of Socratic app I have in mind. So I don't think that's a perfect answer to your question, but perhaps it's the start at least.
Thank you. Thanks. This is so interesting, such a great conversation. I guess I come back to something you were talking about and at the beginning, which was the two things we sort of talked about was conversation and connection.
Yeah.
And I wondered, what is my question? It seems important that the Socratic LLM that you're talking about is sort of perhaps less focused on the conversation with the LLM and the connection with an LLM, because it's just data bits, and more on the connection of a community that might be using an LLM for a particular thing. So that we don't sort of get into the people part, and the conversation of, the heart, like conversation has and shared meaning is among the people. And so I think is that sort of what I take from your talk is sort of that's sort of where you're trying to get with the LLM.
Thank you. I love this question because you enable me to say something I didn't say, which I really care about. So, I use the word transitional spaces or transitional conversational spaces. I haven't really explained why I call them transitional conversational spaces. Now, this word transitional came from, I don't know if you have heard of someone called Winnicott, psychologist, child psychologist, right? Okay. Okay, great. So Winnicott talks about transitional objects. Yeah. And these transitional objects play an important role in facilitating an evolution, potentially. I'll put it simply, because I know I have an educational psychologist. I am intimidated. But basically, the idea here I have in mind for these transitional conversational spaces is to see them as not in any way replacing the role of humans to humans conversations, but on the contrary, serving as spaces that can prepare us, that can make us more likely to be receptive to human encounters, right? And so I find that quite interesting, because if you think about the way in which social media platforms today are very much biased towards certainty, right? You wouldn't go on social media unless you were pretty certain about your views. You don't typically go on, I never go on, what's it called, Meta or whatever it is, and say, no, I'm not quite sure what to do about this. People don't do that when they go on social media. So that's interesting, because I think this has led to part of the big trouble we're in today, is that just people have forgotten to value uncertainty and how to value it. And so perhaps large language models, if they're designed right, it's a big if, right? But could be constituting in an ideal way, transitional conversational spaces where people can explore tentative views in a way that is genuinely flexible enough for them to work out, to become comfortable with uncertainty, if you want, to re-educate us, to re-familiarize us with the navigation of uncertainty, right? That might be the best way of putting it. And so in that way, I hope that large language models can become transitional conversational spaces. That's what I really developed more in the paper I just put. It's called transitional conversational spaces. And I refer to Winnicott a little bit, but not enough. But yeah.
Thank you for the very forward-looking discussion. So I really like the concept of thinkability that you have, which is allowing the user to really interacting back with the system, right? But as you kind of hint at, it is mainly driven for technology to become a cultural technology, which is massively adopted. It needs to be driven by the business model where it solves a very painful point so that people are willing to just jump in and use it immediately. So how do you see the thinkability factor can be played into some of the technology that we talk about here so that it can receive that mass adoption? I was thinking along the line of, for example, in educational environment where it's a lot more receptive to that kind of model, that might be, would that be a good direction for thinkability to be kind of bootstrapped and then we go from there?
Thank you. That's also a great question. I mean, I do actually, I have been asking myself that question, right? It's all very good to talk about tinkerability. I hope you're all familiar now with the term tinkerability, right? It's tinkerable if I can modify something and explore it. And sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes it works, etc. Right? Now, concretely, how does that work? Like, at the moment, we don't have, this is absolutely not tinkerable, right? No question. My phone is not tinkerable. Now, what, short of getting philanthropies to design new products, that's very unlikely, we're gonna need businesses to produce products that are tinkerable. And so how is that gonna fly? How is that gonna work, given that we've all been so conditioned to an attitude of passivity in front of all the tools we use? I mean, I wouldn't dare trying to dismantle this laptop, probably wisely so, right? But so we've been conditioned to being very hands-off with most of the tools we interact with. Very few people now know how to repair their cars, for instance. I mean, because it's also become too complicated, right? So that is a worry, and it's possible that the best entry point is at the education level, early on. So, I mean, my son is a Minecraft fan. Now, Minecraft is not exactly an example of tinkerability. But I find it fascinating, the way in which there is a big difference between the way in which kids play when they play Minecraft and when they play like a traditional computer game, wherever it is. What I love about it is that they literally imagine and create these amazing worlds. And that, to me, there's something significant there. So could we produce tools that are desirable for kids and that are tinkerable? Perhaps this could lead then to, if kids become used to having tools that are tinkerable, they will demand tinkerability. You know, why suddenly have tools that are not tinkerable anymore, right? So I believe that perhaps is the most promising entry point. And I do think we should try and develop tinkerable tools for kids, basically.
Okay, well, I'll take one last question.
Didn't know I was going to be last, sorry. There are armies of people out there who build apps for iPhones, and it's not, there's no centralized model that says it has to be, we have to have this app or that app, or there's just all these people who want to tinker and provide for iPhone users all these different things that they might use it for. It sounds like you're advocating for a sure what, a world in which those tinkerers could create a bunch of apps for LLMs that could then be used in these different ways. And it doesn't have to be that there's a separate market for each one. You could have the idea that people want apps. And so all these other uses could be part of the market for selling the LLM.
Yes, okay, and so that's a fair point. I agree, yeah. And actually, so that's where, legally speaking, for a moment, there's a battle with Apple, for instance, to make sure that they don't necessarily control which apps can make it on their platforms. That's important. Unless we have that, we don't have any inklings of tinkerability, right? But, so apps are it's true, a possible entry point to make these things more tinkerable. I would like to also consider genuinely physical tinkerability, right? Especially for kids. How does that work? Well, I hope there are engineers here who can come up with bright ideas, but there ought to be possible cool things that kids would desire and that can be tinkerable, right?
Let's thank our speaker one last time. Thank you, Sylvie.